Of literary scholars. It's time to start our next session, number 7. And it's my pleasure to present here 4 scholars. 2 are from Latvia and 2 are from Lithuania. And as the first one, let me introduce you to the researcher of the Institute of Literature, Folklore and Arts, University of Latvia, and he's Kārlis Vērdiņš. And Kārlis' presentation will be on queer post-Soviet narratives in interviews by Rita Ruduša and fiction by Klaus Smilgziets. So, Kārlis, the floor is yours.
Viens. Good morning. Isn't it morning? Are we? One of the cultures within culture is the culture of LGBT people, or to use other name, queer culture. In Latvia, it's still practically invisible. In my paper, I'm going to analyze queer narratives of 2 types: documentary life stories collected by Rita Ruduša in her book Forced Underground, and a manuscript of a collection of short stories by Klaus Smilgziets, originally published during the 90s in underground Latvian gay magazine. Both types of texts make different emphases talking about queers in Soviet and post-Soviet life. After regaining of Latvia's independence, a lot of research work has been carried out to collect life stories of people that have lived through the period of Soviet occupation and analyze their experience. Oral History Archive was founded in 1992, and later it became a part of the Institute of Philosophy and Sociology. At the center of this research process, there is the personal experience of people. And the life stories interviews obtained by the researchers are regarded as socially constructed texts, as dialogues between the researcher and his or her respondents that exists in certain social and cultural context. Generally, life stories have been regarded as narrative constructions where the relationship between life and its rendition is intermediated by memory, consciousness, language, situation of interaction, rules of communication, experience of other stories, as well as knowledge of the public social processes. Life stories can be described as situative, spontaneous, and uncensored, because there is no time for careful and long-lasting self-censorship during the interview. Life story is born during the interaction with the interviewer, who actually can be defined as a co-author of the source and partially contributing to its content. His or her attitude during the interview is important, as well as questions asked and the reaction to the story. As it is characteristic to the collected and published stories, they often fall into nationalistic discourse and accent the importance of the ethnic origin, identifying himself or herself as a representative or a certain nation and responsible for its reputation and maintaining all the good qualities that it associates itself with. Eva Garda-Rosenberg defines the mode of these interviews after finishing the project Life Story and Self-Awareness, Oral History in Latvia. Quote, both narrator and interviewer are involved in a meaningful event of narration when narrator's life is transformed into a story and the cup of national self-awareness can be filled, unquote. Such description can be understood as a glorification of the national self-awareness or a process when in mutual efforts some right story is born, which is meant to replace all wrong stories that probably could be told by other people with less national self-awareness. However, Latvian oral history researchers' scope is wider, and reflection of other social groups and their stories also start to take place. For example, interviews with representatives of the Latvian Gypsy community. An English oral historian, Paul Thompson, has noted the purpose of the oral history, besides the historical studies, is to give voice to marginalized and forgotten groups and individuals, to listen to their story and to offer them to have their own perspective, in that way enlarging the focus of our perception of history. His viewpoint is socialist one, and he speaks of importance to unite the stories of various social groups in the national oral history. Latvian researcher Edmunds Šūpulis writes of the new mechanisms that have been created in Latvia to maintain a common historical perspective that regulate the nation's memory of itself and its representations. He also warns of the accentuation of trauma in this process when several groups of people have been marked as victims or aggressors, and the distinction between us and them has been intensified. To see the verity of the experience of Soviet times and to understand the collective memory as unreducible to some particular dominant historical narrative, we have to listen also to memories that at first sight don't fit into politically constructed views. Also, Denis Hanaus has written of the problem of wrong view of history that is held by a part of Latvia's people regarding attitudes to Soviet period and memories of Second World War. Besides ethnic and social minorities, one more group of people that till recently hasn't been given voice is queer community or LGBT community of Latvia. Their memories still seems to be wrong, and as far as I know, usually their experiences are not included in the archives of oral history. This is also a group that could be victimized successfully. In Soviet times, they were bounded by law and also the attitude of society, and also during the last 22 years after decriminalization of male homosexual relations, their status in public view remained low because of imprints of homophobic thinking. As Pēteris Timofejevs Henriksson notes, quote, "In the modern Latvia, nationalist and populist politicians take political advantage of these deep imprints by framing the LGBT community in terms of the dangerous other that is constructed as a political threat to the purity of Latvianness." In this paper, two ways of telling life story will be analyzed. Interviews of representatives of Latvian LGBT community made by Rīta Ruduša will be compared to gay short stories by Klaus Smilgziets. It was interesting to look at these texts and to figure out how open these heroes can be about their emotional and sexual experience, and what features they take as characteristics of their identity, and in what ways silence and situation of closet can be won. So the first inverted fig leaf, life stories in interviews by Rīta Ruduša. From 1987 till 1992, when homosexuality entered the public discourse in Latvia, periodicals published mostly interviews with experts, Soviet sexologists or representatives of justice who expressed their confusion and awkwardness of being questioned on such topic. At the beginning of the 90s, homosexuals were given their own voice, however, it was mostly anonymous. For interviews with gay men were published by Ieva Lešinska in journal Rīgas Laiks in 1994. 1 year later, a Latvian translation of interview book by East German journalist Jürgen Lemke, Ganz normal anders, appeared. It was published by some marginal publisher, Kukors. And from 2010 to 2012, journalist Rīta Ruduša carried out her project interviewing homosexuals in Latvia, including also 3 persons that have emigrated. Latvian edition of this book was published in 2012, and English edition 2 years later. The book contains of 12 chapters, including author's childhood memories of a homosexual man from next door. Another story contains just one page, which explains how the lesbian heroine shared her experience and later banned its publication. There are stories of lesbian Signe and transsexual Olga, as well as publicly known gay men, former pastor Māris Sants and journalist Kārlis Streips. And the rest interviews tell stories of 6 gay or bisexual men of different age, from pensioner Māris to gypsy guy Dainis, whose sexual life started in the 90s. As Ruduša acknowledges, real names and topography in their stories has been changed to enable the anonymity of her heroes. So their life stories do not go into details. We know almost nothing of their taste, hobbies, and other important life experiences besides their sexuality, reflection on their existential problems, and in some cases, their contribution to gay activism in post-Soviet Latvia. Their identity is shown as inverted fig leaf. Exposing their sexual identity, they have to hide other aspects of their life to remain anonymous, for mostly they still have not come out to their parents and other relatives. Some of them still dreams of normal life as having a partner of the opposite sex, children, and following traditional values, despite their sexual drives. Their dreams are based upon the assumption that gay life is meant only for young people who are desirable and can easily find partners for sex, but old age can bring only loneliness and despair. The interviews draw a map of Latvian gay topography that includes cruising places, bars, and beaches. In Soviet time, this map contains of the long circle and short circle in the center of Riga that included some of the most crowded streets and parks next to University of Latvia and the National Opera. Actually, both of these circles were at this Aspazijas Boulevard also, so we are very, very queer place now. And also public toilets in Riga center, unofficial gay beaches in Lielupe and Kalngale, bar Skapis, ironically English translation of Skapis could be closet, and some other friendly cafes. Post-Soviet time has added to this map various clubs, mostly in spaces that were adapted to serve the need for gay disco venues during weekends as Strauma and Aptieciņa. Gradually, they were changed by more stable and public gay clubs as Purvs, 808, XXL, and others, where parts of lives of Ruduša's heroes took place since 90s. Aforementioned 2 respondents, Māris and Dainis, are reported to have told a lot about their sexual experience. However, Ruduša cuts their explicit narratives and leaves only details that would not seem pornographic for mainstream audience. Different version of Māris' life story can be found in his memoirs, published in underground gay magazine Elvis in 2002, under the same name. Many details overlap, and gay reader can enjoy also the explicit sexual content that has been cut in interview, made for the mainstream reader. In these passages, Māris carefully counts his sexual partners, measures the pleasure given by them, their technique, and expectations that either made them suitable for regular secret dates or gradually estranged them from him. All this information might seem pointless for mainstream audience, still for gay readers it can be of some importance. And in the same underground gay magazine, short stories by Klaus Smilziets were published starting from 1994. It was a xerocopied fanzine for homosexual men made by an enthusiast of gay movement, Jancis, who lived in Dagda, a small town in the eastern part of Latvia. It contained articles copied from Latvian official periodicals concerning gay life and celebrities, also personal ads and erotic photos borrowed from foreign gay magazines. Among few original contributions were not only stories of sexual experience, like aforementioned Māris' memoirs and frequent editorials by Jancis, but also around 20 short stories by an unknown author with the pen name Klaus Smilgziets. With kind permission of the author and Jancis, a selection of stories is being prepared for publication under the title Buciņš no Aunu krasta, The Buck from the Ram Coast. Smilgziets, now a man in his 80s, wrote these stories to support the new gay magazine and to make it more appealing to its readers. So his intent was to write accessible, sexually rich gay fiction. However, these stories are not just pornographic prose. Actually, in many of them, sex doesn't take place at all, or stays in the shade of the detailized historical background that deeply affects the relations among gays who try to live emotionally and sexually fulfilled life despite of Soviet and post-Soviet conditions. Heroes of Smilgziets' fiction try to fulfill their need for man-to-man sex or to get into love relationship and maintain it despite of the pressure of others. Being a bisexual married man himself, Smilgziets mostly avoids to depict the inconsistency of such life, except one story, Thirst, where protagonist's desired man meets him after a long break and tells of his unsuccessful marriage. He is not interested neither in women characters or in lesbian love, focusing on male desire that sometimes is compressed in time and sometimes may last for decades. Part of these stories gives feeling of light resignation of the author who constructs his juvenile, emotional and sexually active characters being in his 60s and using his past experience, sometimes openly reflecting of his coming age that permits him only the role of observer when orgy is taking place, as in some of his texts. Similarity to Ruduš's interviews can be found in the topography of these stories. Action takes place mostly in Riga city center, which provide anonymity and possibilities to meet other cruising men. Among most significant places are public toilets, and each of them has its special name in homosexual slang: mausoleum, boudoir, colonnade, personnel department, the last stop at railway station, and also two folklore-inspired names, Suitor's Room or Tautu Istabiņa and Little Yard or Sētiņa. Smilgziets mentions also the long circle and the short circle, also bars and restaurants, public bath and gay beaches, as well as leisure destinations in Russia, Petrozavodsk and Kislovodsk, and of course famous Lithuanian gay beach in Palanga. Smilgziets in his prose also speaks of homophobic attacks that threatened homosexuals in their meeting places. In gay slang they were called repairers, remontieri. In his story with such name he organizes a meeting of a gay narrator and a repairer in a park well known for being a gay cruising place. Probably it was Arkadius Park in Pārdaugava. Narrator recognizes the aggressiveness of the young man and starts a conversation on homosexuality and religion, analyzing also repairer's homophobic passion as suppressed homosexual drive. The story ends when the narrator beats up the repairer and leaves. Like age of Smilgziets' heroes, also his narrative time differ. It can last for many years and include a lasting relationship or meeting after many years to lament the broken love stories or never fulfilled desires. And it can be some hours when men just meet to have quick casual sex that might turn out to be a dangerous adventure. Stories set in 90s use the same locations and attitudes as stories of Soviet time. Smilgziets don't place his heroes into new gay spaces created in Riga and also doesn't send them to fight for the interests of LGBT community. His sentiments are clearly still dwelling in Soviet times when closet was the only one possibility. And on conclusion, Rudusha and Smilgzieds has created their work in different genres, and they represent different perspectives. A closeted homosexual who addresses this closeted gay audience, which would read these erotic stories in private, while Rudusha is a straight woman whose intention is to create stories which would enter into public discourse. Rudusha led her heroes to tell their real-life experiences, still limited by their self-censorship and the need to present their stories to mainstream audience, while Smilgzieds freely interprets this experience, combining it with his influence from porn movies to make it appealing for his closeted audience. Still, there are common features in their work. Both of them draw a map of Soviet and post-Soviet Latvian gay topography, and they tells of ways of communication and finding a partner for casual sex or for more lasting relationship. Both of them also show the slow changes in attitudes of post-Soviet queers. The necessity of remain in the closet still is the most popular opinion, and the importance of joining LGBT organizations and their fight for equality is not their business. So, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Kārlis, for your really interesting presentation. We will follow the order of the conference task. The discussion part will follow. It will be held at the end of the session. So now let's switch to the Lithuanian poetry in the light of European existentialism. So it's my honor to introduce you to our Lithuanian colleague, Eugenijus Žmuida, who is a researcher at the Lithuanian Literature and Folklore Institute. Right, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody. I excuse my English won't be so perfect as my colleague. So now I will start. Two world wars in 20th century made humankind, at least in Europe, more philosophical, and it has an impact on literature. On the other hand, the philosophy has changed. It turns to the man, and we can see that philosophy needed literature even more than literature philosophy, because literature from very beginning had philosophical digressions. Existentialism declares philosophical thinking begins with a human subject, not merely the thinking subject, but the acting, feeling, living human individual. In existentialism, the individual's starting point is characterized by what has been called the existential attitude, or a sense of disorientation and confusion in the face of an apparently meaningless world. Existential philosophy in Lithuania gained in popularity among young people in the third decade of the 20th century and later. And already in 1936, Joseph Girnius chose the topic for his graduation thesis, The Principles of Heidegger's Existential Philosophy. Girnius also attended seminars by Martin Heidegger in Germany. Later he turned to philosophy by Karl Jaspers. In 1951, he was awarded as Doctor for Thesis Liberty and Being, Existential Metaphysics of Karl Jaspers. The main work of Girnius, Man Without the God, in which he widely discussed existential problems in European literature, was published in 1933. Antanas Maceina is another important name for spreading ideas of existentialism in Lithuanian culture. Girnius and Maceina both lectured in Kaunas and Vilnius University during the Second World War and were introducing existential philosophy to students, using for the analysis of philosophical concepts, the fictional works by Rilke, Hölderlin, Ibsen, Dostoevsky, and others. These lectures influenced almost an entire generation of young Lithuanian poets who made their debut during the Second World War and now are classic of Lithuanian poetry. Vytautas Mačernis, Alfonsas Nyka Niliūnas, Bronius Krivickas, Henrikas Nagys. The Second World War and the post-war situation in Lithuania was a turning point in the Lithuanian literature. The second Soviet occupation in 1944 forced a huge wave of immigration. The majority of the Lithuanian intellectuals left their own country and found himself in a really extreme homeless situation. Thought existentialism became popular in the years following Second World War, and the main authors of this period are Sartre and Camus. The roots of existentialism was to be traced back in the 19th century. Søren Kierkegaard is generally considered to be the first existential philosopher, so he did not use the term existentialism. Also in literature, the main themes of existentialism have been developed much more earlier in works such as authors as Dostoevsky, Kafka, Rilke, Ionesco, Eliot, Hesse, and writers of last generation. The same thing we could see in Lithuania, where already, as was said above, in the third decade of the 20th century, philosophers discusses works of Nietzsche and Heidegger. In Lithuanian literature, the problems of being and human existence were developed in the poetry by Vincas Mykolaitis Putinas. His collection of verses Between Two Downs, 1927, made key turn to existentialism in Lithuanian literature. Mykolaitis focuses his attention on the condition of human existence, personal responsibility, the meaning and purpose of life. Entering the pantheon of Lithuanian literature as seminarian in 1911, in 1934 he cut down the tradition of priest writers in the autobiographical novel In the Shadows of Altars, declaring it's impossible to be a priest and a poet at the same time, because a priest isn't a free person. So the main themes of existentialism, freedom, authentic living, and personal responsibility for own choice let us ground in poetry of Mykolaitis. Seemingly long period of searching himself, doubt, and scrapple enabled Mykolaitis to construct the binary world of two struggling opposites and create a dramatic inner tension in his poetry. Is a man free to choose his own fate, or he is determined by God? Can he show his own face, or he have to hide under the mask? And finally, is he able for wild action to cut all the bounds, to reject all the authorities and enter the realm of freedom, or is damned to stay with the slave's consciousness in never-ending reflections? To act, to live is a very important call in Mykolaitis' poetry, dealing with important statesmen of existentialist philosophy. The existence precedes essence. Being well-known poet and writer, literary critic and scientist, working professor in Kaunas University, and changing the Young Poet Society, Mykolaitis made impact on younger generation of future philosophers and poets. Few of them, first of all, Vytautas Mačernis and Alfonsas Nyka Niliūnas, can be named followers of Mykolaitis. They stayed focused on the existential problematic and developed the same themes, but already in a more dramatic situation of war and post-war, homelessness and exile. Nyka Niliūnas writes philosophical lyric poetry that examines the place of the individual in the world, with which tragedy and cataclysm on both the personal and on the universal scale define the parameters of human existence. The sense of exile and loss that marked his earliest poems takes a subtle hues and tones in his later works. Throughout his career, his poetry resonates with the underlying concern with loneliness, emptiness, weariness of the spirit, and loss of illusion that is painful to contemplate, and yet often tender and poignant in the simplicity of its articulation. It is emotional and intellectual discourse compiled in a singular aesthetic vision, which defines him and for the reader what it means to be human in a difficult and often implacable world, what this means to try to find a place both physical and metaphysical in which to live with some measures of meaning. As he writes in autobiography 1986, without cessation I cut myself on airplanes and trains, occasionally sent myself throughout the mail, trying to find a place in being and time. That search includes trying to find the essence of oneself, separated from the land of one's birth, from the social cultural framework one understands, and to do so while weathering the storms of knowing that shapes one's life. That search can be exhausting, and it can, in fact, as life progresses, become increasingly and even more deeply painful. I was then only a meaningless word in search of myself, not yet the wound I have now become. Is a heartbreaking reflective definition of the self. The hardest themes of the existentialism were most deeply exhausted by Niliūnas. And then the question arises, can any existentialist tell us how to live in such an absurd and hopeless world? Searching the way from the deadlock, we have to turn outside into another form of existentialism, which usually is called Christian existentialism. It stresses subjective aspect of the human person considered as a creation of God. Søren Kierkegaard, of course, is a philosopher of Christian existentialism, but the roots could be traced back as far as Saint Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, Blaise Pascal, who saw human existence in terms of paradoxes. Is that, for example, that we know truth not only by reason but also by heart, that is the fight alone that pleases us, not the victory. There are two main poets in Lithuanian poetry who we could name Christian existentialists. They are Antanas Jasmontas, the same philosopher Antanas Maceina, and Leonas Andriekus. Both were forced to leave a native country. Jasmontas stayed in West Germany. Father Andriekus moved to the United States. The Lithuanian emigre poets suffer a double painful kind of exile and separation. Contemplative silence in both a product and a creator of solitude. Because of historical events and political forces beyond man's control, they had been driven from the land of his birth and forced into the painful state of literal as well as metaphorical homelessness. Throughout the anxiety of displacement symbolized, Jasmantas and Andriekos have managed to find relief for the ravaged consciousness and spirit. They fight, doubt, questioning, and often paralyzing insecurity which exile brings pose the danger of a poetry of nostalgia or of nihilism. Jasmantas and Andriekos express those emotions in their poems and are often tortured by them, but in the end they transcend them and avoid despair because they realized that the true home of both the literal and metaphorical exile is God. Religion, the life of the spirit, offers solace to the man who witnesses the agonies of the Eastern European experience. But the religious passion expressed in poems is distinctly non-sentimental, one which avoids the easy platitude and the empty adulatory phrases and is marked by a spiritual toughness, little interested in expounding dogma or laying down the rules of practical morality. There is a mystical quality of these poems, a sense of constant revelation of God as one who in turn reveals himself in all living and growing things of the earth and in the harmony of the birds and stars. Summarizing Lithuanian poetry in the context of European existentialism is got to be said the most prominent problem for Mykolaitis was that of choice. In his late poetry, it could be seen fear of death and the desire to escape. Machernis believed in living and in fighting for life. Existentialism took the darkest color in Niliūnas poetry, sometimes reaching the verge of an absurd. But all the main themes of European existentialism, such as loneliness, alienation, suffering, anxiety, and despair, nothingness, meaningless, and absurdity, were widely discussed and developed in Lithuanian poetry. Lithuanian culture for a long time felt inferiority complex caused by an unfortunate historical circumstances. And there is the first time when Lithuanian poetry finds itself in the European literature as synchronic movement. While existentialism was never an organized literary movement, the tenets of his philosophy have influenced many diverse writers around the world. As a result, we can talk about it as a general phenomenon. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eugenius. Yes, now we need a little change of places since the next presentation will have some visual addition. So the next speaker is Inga Žolude. She's a PhD candidate at the University of Latvia, the Faculty of Humanities. And the title of her presentation is Confessional Poetry in Latvia as a Form of Freeing the Self. So,
dear colleagues, hello. Can you see it well? Confessional poetry has been a theme of my dissertation for the last 6 years, so I could talk hours on that, but I will try to squeeze in 20 minutes, so when the time passes, just please interrupt me. We have to just look briefly at what confessional poetry is, but I will not dwell upon it because this is not the theme of today. So basically, this is a genre of poetry originated in the United States in the 20th century, the second half of the 20th century. And the first poetry book that comes out is in 1959, and it's Robert Lowell's collection of poetry, which is called the first confessional poetry. The most important points are that the author and the lyrical eye of the poem coincide, and they are autobiographical. So the writers speak of their real experience and their real suffering. What I try to argue is that there is confessional poetry in Latvia, in Latvian literature, and I have to say that unlike the previous speaker who spoke on existentialism and said that it was historically simultaneous, is that right? Yeah, but we can't say that about confessional poetry in Latvia because it was not simultaneous. It was impossible to be simultaneous with the movement in the United States, which spread also to other countries at the same time. But in Latvia, we can start speaking of it only in the late 80s. Maybe some separate poems in the late 70s by Amanda Aizpurieta, but really very marginal position. What are they freeing themselves from? We have to speak on the name of the genre, and this is confessional poetry. This is a very inconvenient term, and the person who attributed this name to the genre was also quite disappointed with his achievement, kind of, because, you know, immediately this brings the religious discourse into it, and there is no connection between the confessional poetry and the religion. Well, not a direct one. The thing that is common is that the concept of confession, but not in the religious sense. I think that Foucault has put it pretty precisely, that confession is a ritual technique in which the truth is constructed among two partners. So the one who confesses and the other who hears the confession, but the other one can be also a virtual partner, like God or reader or the poet, him or herself. And this ritual technique is common also in the early Christianity and the discourses outside Christianity. So unlike some African tribes who have never heard of Christianity, they have a ritual technique of constructing truth. Yeah. And what else? This is not a mimetic ritual, so it does not reflect a pretextual truth, but it comes to the truth during the ritual. So, in confessional poetry, therefore, you will not hear a confession of violating one of 10 commandments, but instead you will hear a true admittance of violation, if you may say so, of some even unwritten but existing in the society moral norms, societal standards, ethical. They will speak of trauma, and also they will challenge ideological, overarching ideological ideas or mood, and thus they will also challenge poetic tradition. When we speak about this freeing of oneself, there are a lot of synonyms that we could use. And as also the speaker before, Karls Verdiņš, who spoke on queer and used this very nice translation of skapis as a closet, and the metaphor of coming out, which is originally used in homosexual discourse, has traveled to confessional poetry discourse, and is used not only for homosexual identity, which is one of the theme of confessional poetry. So in confessional poetry, poets use the mode of confessional poetry to come out as admitting their queer, can we say queer identity? Homosexual identity. I will like to concentrate basically on 3 examples of Latvian poetry that we could say are confessional poems. Here is an example in the Latvian. I have in the next slide also in English. I just wanted you to see the big volume of this poem. So this is a poem of Inga Gaile, and it's called Ibio Rio. You can hardly say that it is a poem. It could be a prose poem, a poem in prose, prose in poem, stream of consciousness, whatever you like. But you can see definitely that it challenges the concept of traditional poetic form. If we look at it, so we look at the first part, this side, Ibio Rio. This is a rough translation of mine, so please forgive me. And this is only a small excerpt that I wanted to concentrate. If we the poet admitted that the poem was written as a homework. She did drama studies at the Academy of Culture, and one of the conductors of the course set a homework for the students to write a curriculum vitae. And she chose, she was an established poet at that time already, and she chose a form of a poem, so she wrote this poem, Ibio Rio, which is her kind of curriculum vitae. Looking at it biographically, autobiographically, we can see that it has all the main points of a biography. So it starts with the birth, with the parents, family, I was born in summer, blah, blah, blah. And it concentrates on the main turning points of one's life. And I have chosen the fragment of the most important turning point, founding point, turning point in the poet's life. And you see the line towards the end which starts, and then I ran into the forest. Can you see it? And this is about the violence, experience of male violence against female, that the poet has experienced herself. So she has suppressed the subject for approximately 20 years, and then following the studies of drama, she had to do an exam, so she had to stage a play. She was a director of the play Our Sylvia in Heaven. There you can see on the other side. So she was the director of the play, and she also wrote the text of the play. So what is this? Who is this Sylvia? This is, of course, Sylvia Plath. And this we can hardly call a coincidence, because Sylvia Plath is one of the canonical confessional poets in the American literature. But what's important, the spectators view the play, and suddenly the stage goes dark, dims, the actors leave the stage, and then comes the director of the play from the side with her monologue, and it is something like, you see the last bigger excerpt on the other side, which starts with like, I would like to hear your voices. Can you see it? This is an excerpt from the program of the play, where she basically states the concept of the or the idea or the theme of the play, and basically it's about, you know, please say aloud once and for all, take your courage and say that you are not happy with your life, you would like to live other way, just admit it to yourself, be honest to yourself. So when she comes during the play on stage, she says something similar to that, and she admits the experience of the violence that she has experienced twice in her life, and she has been silenced. She has kept it in silence. She has silenced the subject for the subsequent 20 years approximately. And you can see the same subject turning up also in her other poem, in the latest collection of the poetry called Fog. And this is on the other side, the first small fragment. And this is also an excerpt from this long poem, Fog. I tell you indeed, it's really scary, but nevertheless, once and for all, come, please, out. Or wait, be considerate to yourself. But in the meantime, I will start breathe here quietly. So she has come out in a way, as I said, that the metaphor has traveled in a different sense to confessional poetry. She has started speaking on the subject of the experience of violence, thus going through a poetic self-therapy, which is also one of the core concepts of the confessional poetry as such. And I think that the breath and breathe is is very important. So when we look at the Bio Rio, I was born, so this is a point where a person starts breathing, and breathe, simply breathe, is the last line in this play, Our Sylvia in Heaven. So this is the last line that actors say on the stage, breathe, simply breathe. In a way, talking about this subject, going through it again, meditating it upon it, and thus healing the wounds, the author can set a new 0 point of the life and start to live after trauma. And this is ensured by this poetic act of confessional poetry. Then we have another example of Gunārs Godiņš. This is also a rough translation of mine. This is also an excerpt from a longer poem. It's on 3 pages approximately. So this is the first part of the poem. He says, this is a poem that nobody would refer to when speaking about Gunārs Godiņš. This is not really characterizing his poetics. He's very known for poems anti-ideological, against ideology, poems such as "Without Your Own Language, You Are a Piece of Crap," or some others that he wrote in 70s and was prohibited to publish for subsequent 2 years. And about this poem, he says that he wrote it in the beginning of 90s, the collection of the poetry called, where this poem is published, is called Bringer of Shadows. Can we say that? Somebody who brings shadows, in other words. And he says that this was the situation, you know, when everybody lived in this Soviet times, in the literary situation that was regulated by states. So the themes and the mode of expression was regulated. So everybody strived for world thought, world literature, world philosophy, and you couldn't get to it all, just secretly and with big effort. And suddenly the Latvia gains independence, and you can get all of it, everything. And he says, but nobody needed it anymore. Nobody. And he said, I was sick of my colleagues, of my colleague poets who still in the 90s continued to write about all the Latvian mythological symbols, like, you know, stars and goddesses, pagan, and so bringing still in the 90s, re-establishing the national identity, national mood. He said, I was really sick of it. I was in a depression. So I wrote this poem as a stream. It's written as a stream of consciousness, and really depicts the oppressive mood of that time. You could you can see in this poem he mentions suicide, and he mentions vomiting, and these are not these are not. Oh, 3 minutes, great. I almost managed. And yeah, so this is what you usually don't find in poetry, but which you always, often find in confessional poetry. Okay, I jump to my last example. It's also a very exquisite Latvian confessional poem, Jan Selsberg's poem called Tom Glen. It's a very, very long poem, even longer than the previous 2. So I put just few excerpts, again, a rough translation of mine. This poem is written in a form of Buddhist meditation called Tom Glen, which he also explains in the poem itself, and it's about breathing in all the bad stuff, all your worries or your depression, sufferings, or your bad memories, and converting it inside yourself, meditating upon them, cleansing in a way, and breathing out something pure, pure, something good. And I would like you to pay attention to the fragment in the bold. The emphasis is mine. So he says, I inhale the hands of Klaus murderer, which he swipes in his trousers in the hallway, step back from the broken window. So you can continue reading. But this is... as I said, confessional poetry is autobiographical, and it's about poet's brother who was killed during the Soviet times. The official version is that he was, did suicide, or it was an accident or something, but the unofficial version is that he was helped, by somebody. So it's a recurring theme in Jan Selsberg's poetry. And the moment of the confession that you can see is, I think it's very talking itself. I exhale, I inhale the silence of and lies of accessories, and my joy when 17 years later I learned about their deaths. So he's happy about people dying, I exhale forgiveness and peace, at least I try to exhale forgiveness and peace. I don't know into which direction goes my breath now. So he admits that he is not sorry. He's not sorry, So this is about confessional poetry, about the inconvenient subjects that poets speak about, not really changing things, as Carlis Verdiņš spoke on homosexual literature, homosexual theme in literature, and he said that topography names and people's names are changed for the reasons of anonymity. It's exactly the opposite in the confessional poetry, which is really direct. Yes, so basically I think I can wrap up and say that these are really hard, inconvenient themes that very often compromise the authors themselves, and they know what they are doing and still they do it. And why do they do it? Because of as the main advantage of this mode is the self-therapy that this mode provides. So I would be happy to answer some questions if you have any discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inga. And it is really nice to have another scholar from Vilnius, from Institute of Lithuanian Literature and Folklore. Ramute Draganite is a PhD student, and the title of her paper is The Conception of National Literary History. So, you have
Good afternoon. My report focuses on the conception of national literary history. What do we call national literary history? What are the limits of its definition? In the last decades, we disputed about the need of literary history and the methods of writing it. Debates about literary history have been a part of Western literary culture when it grew out of 18th century antiquarian interests. Many fundamental principles of Western literary history as a modern discipline were established in the 19th century. The version of the story of the past told by the present have always been associated with question of cultural authority and identity. So the writing literary history coincided with the appearance of national identity. Since 19th century, the identity was mostly national, and the history played a significant role in the formation of national self-imaginings. So in the Western culture, national literary history was a gene of 19th or the beginning of the 20th century. In the postmodern theory, such histories are called grand narratives. It is a term used by Francis Lyotard in 1979. He proclaimed a distrust of grand narrative, saying that narrative at the end of 20th century is losing its functions, its great hero, the great risk of major tours and big target. The other more radical position is formulated by Linda Huchon, who attacks national histories in her analysis, calling it historiographic metafiction. Even though she uses this term for exploring postmodern novels, but writing about literary histories, she says that they are fictions of power. This power can be ideological, political, or just power of romantic imagination. In this case, we read grand narratives as novels or heroic epos. Despite the national model, the most of grand narratives are theological and epigenetic. This model often is expressed in evolutionary metaphors of organic growth. Originally structured on the Romantics' idealist philosophy of history, with its emphasis on the importance of origins and the assumption of continuous organic development. This model was intended to establish an implicit parallel between the progress of the nation and of its literature. The main features of grand narrative are some kind of plot, literary participants' heroism, careful selection and rejection of literary facts, canonization of texts and authors. Since the beginning of writing grand narrative, we can draw several models of literary history, each one of which responds to the political and academic reality of our own times in its own way. National model has always been premised on ethnic and linguistic singularity and purity. There are several kinds of nationalism which can determine literary histories: linguistic, ethnic, patriotic nationalism. It seems that each literary history should be clearly defined, but when we talk about literature of concrete country, national models are quite different and legitimating of certain power which expresses the character and spirit of each nation. For example, the first author of the Polish literature grand narrative, Felix Pienkowski, in his Polish literary history, written in 1814, gave a lot of attention to classical literature, especially ancient translations. These canonical texts, from Homer, Iliad, and Odyssey to the greatest world texts of the 17th century, look like not only as a supplement, but also as a part of Polish literature which enriched the national spirit. It is interesting because in Lithuanian literary histories, from the beginning of writings to the latest literary histories, translations are almost not for attention, with the exception of religious writings. In general, one of the most pressing problems in Lithuanian literary histories was linguistic nationalism. Literature in other languages. In the first fragments of the literary historiography in the 19th century, there was no difference between texts in Lithuanian and Polish, especially if Polish authors wrote about Lithuanians' glorious past. These stories were determined by a romantic view. At the end of the 19th century and at the beginning of the 20th century, at the period of nation's rebirth, the situation has changed by awakening national consciousness. These facts destined that in the first Lithuanian literature's grand narratives written by Jonas Šliūpas, 1819, and Maironis, 1906, the literature in Polish, even Adam Mickiewicz, has been deliberately ignored. Lithuanian literature historiography father Mykolas Biržiška at the beginning of the 20th century talked about the need to include the literature of other nations in our literary history. And he did it including literature written in Polish in his book, The History of Our Writings, in 1925. At that time, it was a revolutionary idea because he expanded the concept of the national literature and delayed the start of the Lithuanian literature of the 16th to 14th centuries. Our literature was written in Ruthenian, Polish, and Latin languages, but according to Biržiška, nevertheless it was a national. However, Biržiška was not a cosmopolitan. Other language versions seemed only ones that are conceptually and thematically touched Lithuania. It was a prerogative of grand narrative. Texts in the other languages were absorbed the idea of one nation. Post-colonial studies have been addressing globalization and its effects in the literary field over the last few centuries with a keen eye for the interaction between knowledge and power. This had opened the horizon of literary studies to transnational modes of textuality produced within the circuits of communication established by Western political and cultural dominance, but has left what lies outside those circuits, such as older literature, untouched. During the interwar period, discussion of literature written in Polish was not over, but in the literary histories it almost wasn't included. Polish literature has been an object of criticism and controversy, although it was recognized that the texts of Mickiewicz were the source of our national ideas. During the Soviet occupation, published academic literary history, although with ideological Marxist viewpoint, generated the discourse which has been formulated and created in the interwar period. In this discourse, literature written in Polish was not ignored, but on the other hand, it imposed only a small paragraph of fine print. The following paragraphs echoed Lithuanian literary history written in exile. In the recent 19th century Lithuanian literary history, it is said that Polish language for creating literary ideology is more complex. Lithuanian literature in Polish is an important part of the Lithuanian culture. It has the most influence for the literature written in Lithuanian. A majority of the literature in Polish was most typical Lithuanian topic. Paradoxically, that literature had to educate Lithuanian national consciousness and inspire patriotism. 21st century literary histories raise the question of cultural heterogeneity. One of the examples is Vilnius literature's counterpoints, early modernism, written by Mindaugas Kvietkauskas. The title of the book draws attention to point out that there are viewed not one but several literatures. Such literary histories are defined as synchronous researches and not pretend to grand narrative. As a micro-narrative, those stories promote multicultural heterogeneity and refuse the modern fanatism of nationalism. The patient nostalgic of origins and often utopian projection into the future inform literary history's models for its consistent appeal to any group that has felt oppressed by dominant powers on the level of nation, but also of gender, ethnicity, and language. For example, Lithuanian literary history with the title written by a woman. Like nations, all marginalized groups are turned to the past in search of identity, tradition, and self-understanding. Such histories not only create continuities, but in the process confer legitimacy. That was the intent of the nationalist founders of the form in the past, and it is one of the aims of its interventionist practitioners today. Literary historians may even end up resetting essentialist notions of culture and history, conservative notions of linguistic property, and the otherness ensuing from them. Even though the fiction of cultural purity still persists and the conception of national literary history was expanded from linguistic to territorial principles, but the idea of the nation is still tied placeable bonding. Efforts have been made from time to time to introduce an international perspective into literary history, but most projects in the field are still conceived within a nationalist framework. Literary history as a genre of our memory confirms national identity, but can it be purely national as we live in the multicultural and transcultural world? Purely national history will be a metafiction and imaginary discourse determined by academic or fashion theoretical power. So, and the questions still persist: how in the globalized, multinational and diasporic world can we explain the continuing appeal not only of the single nation, single ethnicity focus of literary history, but also of its familiar theological model, deployed even by those writing the new literary histories based on a number of identity categories. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Ramute. And now it is time for the discussion part. Both general, broad, and very detailed questions are very welcome. I see line already. And Carlis, Eugenius, Inga, and Ramute will gladly answer. The microphone is in order, and both is taking care of it.
Hello, thank you. I have a question to Carlis and a question to Inga. To Carlis, it's probably rather a comment than a question, but have you tried to apply the idea of topography expressed by Michel de Certeau? Because he was also writing about this idea of doing mundane daily activities like walking in the city and thus making the sense of the place. And a question to Inga. Your presentation was very interesting to me because I am doing research in autobiographical film, and to me it is very difficult to draw the borders between the genres in autobiographical film, because there is like first-person film, the subjective eye film, diaries, travelogues, essay films, and all of them contain some autobiographical impulses. But at the same time, you can't really draw like distinctive borders between them. So the question is whether it's well, it's not easy, but how you can draw the borders and determine that this poetry or this particular poem belongs to confessional poetry or not autobiographical, you know, revealing or expressing yourself.
I think this question of topography is very important and interesting, and I also think of it a lot in my research on queer subjects in Latvian culture. And actually, I have made a queer Riga tour, and it will be available as an entertainment during Europride 2015. And some pilot excursions will be held in this autumn in ILGA Europe Conference for gay activists from Europe. So, yeah, I think I will continue to think of it.
Will it be a literary tour based on literary?
No, not only.
Yes, concerning the question of autobiography and genre distinction, it's very difficult. It's very difficult, I agree. Especially because confessional poetry is divided from autobiographical poetry. There is also such genre, from spiritual poetry, from esoterical poetry, from witness poetry, which is also separate genre, and it's very difficult. It's really indeed very difficult. As I said, this was not the presentation of today to speak of all the detailed characteristics of the confessional poetry, but I have put there and spoken of some basic of them, so that this is based there is this autobiographical moment, and this one of the basic methods that is applied in the discourse of the analysis of the confessional poetry is biographical methods. So collecting this data and seeing the reference in the works, literary works, and analyzing them.
Thank you. Yes, in the back row.
Thank you. I have questions to Inga Jolude, and I have questions to Ramute Dragenite. I'm sorry if I'm mispronouncing. Okay. First, indeed, I was dismayed at your historical perspective. Why did you choose American poetry of the 50s, 60s of the 20th century as a point of departure? And probably you know that points of departure become sacral with the passing of time. And you, being a scholar, probably know that you are not just describing, but you are constructing and prescribing. So what kind of cultural continuum do you construct when you say that confessional poetry starts about 1960 in the United States? These were my related questions. And I would ask my final question. It's not ironic. Are you interested in the phenomenon, insofar it exists, of literary scholars' confession? Thank you very much. This was my question to you, and now I will proceed to my other questions. To Ramute, do you have a recent history of Lithuanian literature from a clerical or at least some kind of a Christian perspective? This is my first question. Then, do you have a literary history of the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, written not in a big center of Western scholarship? And my third question, do you have any literary history, more or less comprehensive, of Vilnius? Thank you very much.
Thank you for the questions. Regarding the time span that you asked about, is I was describing the genre. So the origin of the genre is dated back to the 1959, kind of. And as I also referred in my presentation, also to my colleague's presentation about the Lithuanian existentialism, which apparently was in a historically simultaneous time, confessional poetry is not in historical simultaneity with American literary tradition, as it is not in the rest of the world, because since its origin, it only later traveled to other cultures. It is also different, represented in a different time in the Latvian literature, also due to historical and ideological reasons. So, and regarding the literary scholars' confession, could you put your question in a more detailed form?
Okay, it's perfect. It's perfect as a side answer, but I want an answer from you. I mean that
I cannot be more specific. Of course, you have diaries of literary scholars and some kinds of essays. I won't be so strict in delimiting a genre like you. So would you answer my question whether you are interested in such kind of confessions? Maybe you cannot answer it, I don't know.
Ko mums darīt ar to mikrofonu?
As I said, there are many genres in prose, poetry, and so on, dealing with confessions, the concept of autobiography, and so on. As in the focus of this particular research, I am not focusing on the literary scholars' confessions. Thank you.
Thank you, Inga. And now Ramute will answer.
So my answer is that we haven't got such histories just about Vilnius early period, early modernism till 1915. And we haven't got any histories about from the Christian view and histories about Polish.
Thank you. Any more questions or comments? Yes, somebody else.
Yes, it is interesting, for example, that Lithuanian first literary histories first is contrary, different in ideology view. For example, Šliūpas first literary history is very as liberal position of view, and Maironis, of course, it is Christian position. So the first two literaries were written by very different positions, and of course they were discussing between themselves.
Thank you very much for your comment. Yes, one more question.
I have just some thoughts I would like to share with Inga. I really enjoyed your presentation, which was also as a genre quite different. So probably can we make a generalization that, for example, in these examples you gave us, there was at least in two examples this breathing and breath was repeated. For me it was really interesting because of course breath is also symbol of a spirit or something that is just like getting inside out, because breath coming from inside, going outside has like a symbolic meaning, because a confession is also something that is very deep inside, and the confessional technique is getting this or making this inside very personal stuff outside. And also I think that, and I got impression that that confessional poetry is also dealing quite embodied experiences, that this is a bodied experience seems to be very interesting. And also in the field of theater, we in Estonia use also confessional I'm talking about confessional production, which are mostly documentary productions, but also like based on this kind of very personal experiences. So I just wanted to get some kind of confirmation or explanation that, do you think that also the confessional poetry presents subjects somehow differently than other genres of poetry, or is it not?
Thank you for the questions. Yes, I confirm your assumptions. It is indeed very much concerned with bodily experiences, and because bodily experiences have very often been in, especially in poetry, euphemized or aestheticized, and in confessional poetry there is a trend of speaking directly about it. and body, female body, homosexualism, sexual identity, female sexual identity are all very common themes in the confessional poetry, just because they are being taboo for so long. Yes, the phenomenon of breath, I wouldn't like to speculate about the symbolic value of it as denoting a spirit or something, as confessional poetry strives to break away from symbols as such. But due to my excess in time, I did not apparently mention a very interesting remark regarding the last poem that I spoke about Jānis Ellsberg's poetry about this Buddhist meditation in and out, and he didn't notice it himself. His attention to this subject was turned by the editor of the book, Jānis Rokpelnis, who said, well, to the poet, who said, you know, editing your poetry book, I see there's a lot of breath in it. And you know, all the people who had some problems with breathing, they are always writing about breath. And Jānis Ellsberg said, yeah, well, yes, indeed, I have asthma. And in this presentation, I think there was also a fragment about this asthmatic breath, yeah? So it's very important from that point of view. And in the poems or in works of Inga Gaile, I think breath is, it's more of denoting the life, the surviving, being alive, as I said, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Anybody else, please? Yes, I see someone.
My question is for Eugenius, if I may. I wonder how Latvian existentialist poetry, or its authors' poems, how did they understand their role during the period of the Second World War? Was this more in a way of, for example, early Sartre and his solipsism, or was it this understanding more in a way of personal responsibility or moral choice for being engaged in this creation of history?
Lithuanian poetry.
Thank you. Yes, I think it's more about the free choice. They concentrated about the personal responsibility and free choice. And maybe in latest years, written already in exile, Lithuanian poetry just concentrated about the meaningless of life and kind of absurd of life. They reach the verge of it. So it's okay. Thank you.
Okay, if any short question to end? If not, so actually it's time to come to conclusion of a session. Let me thank all the 4 presenters and also thank you very much for being such an attentive audience. So now it's time for a lunch break and see you later at the final session, closing session, right?